This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
Owen says that a pastor's life should be vocal. A pastor's life should be vocal. And then the people's responsibility is to listen and to really pay heed to everything that is good and imitable in his conduct and conversation.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well. Looking forward to a good conversation about the duties of church members to their ministers.
Yes, this is going to be a conversation between the two of us, and I'm looking forward to it as well. We're actually using as the jumping off point a work by John Owen. If you have the works of John Owen, this is in volume 13, and the title in that work is perhaps a little obscure. It's called Eshcol, a cluster of the fruit of Canaan, brought to the borders for the encouragement of the saints traveling thitherward with their faces toward Zion, or rules of direction for the walking of the saints in fellowship according to the order of the gospel. And Banner of Truth has very helpfully excerpted this from the works and entitled it Duties of Christian Fellowship, which is, I think, a much more accessible title from Owen. And Owen here deals with the duties of Christian fellowship in all sorts of ways, duties of church members to one another, but we're going to focus on one of them, one of those ways that Owen goes into detail about and talk about it biblically. And that's the duties of church members toward their pastors. Ministers are, as we know from the scriptures, ones that we're to look to and submit to. Hebrews 13 says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. So, James, what are some of the duties that church members have in light of that biblical mandate to their pastors?
Well, Owen, in a very short space, gives seven directions for how we should relate to our ministers. And the first one, he says, is that they should be submitted to because of their authority. And he's talking particularly with regard to their office as being instituted by Christ, that this is not a power or an authority that they have conferred upon themselves, but that in fact the office itself was instituted by Christ, that among other things that Christ gives to his church, when he gives gifts to his church, he gives also pastors and teachers. And so they're to be received, so far as they are qualified biblically, they're to be received gratefully as gifts of Christ to his church. And for this reason, we're in great danger if we disdain those who've been given the rule and authority over us, because those are really Christ's men. But I thought it was interesting in the text that you read from Hebrews, where the apostle writing this at the very end says, let them do their work with joy and not with grief. And then he even appeals to your own self-interest, which I think Scripture's not below this, for that would be unprofitable to you. And actually, I think the one thing to remember is that when we submit and give honor to those to whom honor is due, we're actually doing something good for ourselves. And I think I don't want to miss that little point, because it's so biblical, that if you want to be happy in the church, you should be laboring for the joy of the minister who labors for your joy. It really is a mutual relationship that way.
Yeah, that is always a striking note at the end of that verse, that it is bad for you as a Christian to have your pastor laboring without joy. And of course, there are difficulties in pastoral ministry. There are challenges. Some of them may be beyond your control. But nonetheless, if your pastor is laboring without joy, if it is a burden to him, if it is a grief to him, then this actually hurts you. And that deep connection between pastor and people is something that is certainly there in that verse from Hebrews, and really is found throughout Owen's whole analysis of what church members ought to do and how they ought to behave towards their pastors.
I think also maybe sometimes it would help just to, if you were ever without a pastor, to remember what that was like. Or if you are in a church where you have one pastor, but you don't have a plurality of elders who carry that shepherding role with him, that's actually something that we pray for. In fact, in Matthew 9, Jesus says, "Pray that the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And so recognize that when someone has come to devote his life to, as it were, till the ground, to cast the seed, to water it, to nurture it, to help prune it through the ministry of the word and sacraments, that you really rejoice in the work that God has given him to do. These are the laborers in the vineyards that we have prayed for. And then when they're sent out, let's do everything that we can to honor them and to let them do that work joyfully.
All right. Well, honoring, of course, has a number of facets to it, but that's not where Owen leaves off. And so what does he address next beyond just giving honor to the minister of the gospel?
He says that we should also observe the minister carefully. And I think there's maybe a quick warning on this. He doesn't mean it in the sense of that overly censorious nitpicking that sometimes congregants can have toward their ministers, the kind of the perfection that would be impossible for any man to attain, but to watch them carefully, because if they are indeed biblically qualified for the office, they are given to us as examples. And in fact, often the apostles exhort those who are under their care to imitate them. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4:16, "I urge you to imitate me." And then in Hebrews 1:7, he says of those who are faithful, whose faith follow, considering the outcome of their conduct. I thought of one other text that Owen gives, 2 Thessalonians 3:7, "For you yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we were not disorderly among you." And I think this is an important thing, that the minister is to be followed in a certain respect, not slavishly or uncritically. This is not to militate against the Berean spirit. There are the cases where someone like Aquila and Priscilla come and gently approach Apollos and together instruct him in the way more rightly. So it's not that there isn't room for the church member to give help even in matters of doctrine to the minister, but that still we are to be looking to our ministers as exemplars of faithful men. They wouldn't be pastors and elders if they weren't recognized as faithful men, and we're to really study them. And what we're not just studying them personally, Jonathan. We're looking for Christ in them. In fact, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3 that Christians are a letter written of Christ, written by the Holy Spirit. But ministers, in a certain sense, are supposed to be excellent in this particular area. They are to be living letters of Christ. Owen says that a pastor's life should be vocal. A pastor's life should be vocal. And then the people's responsibility is to listen and to really pay heed to everything that is good and imitable in his conduct and conversation.
Yeah, and this leads to, I think, a really important point that Owen makes, because we are supposed to observe and in some cases emulate our pastors. They are there not just as spokesmen for God in their words, but in their actions. And yet he acknowledges, look, pastors are sinners. And you're going to find, as you walk with someone, as you watch them, you're going to find all kinds of infirmities, all kinds of strengths and weaknesses, perhaps even sins in their life, temptations that they struggle with, and his counsel there is to cover over a multitude of sins with love, to view them with charity. And it's not that you're overlooking obvious, gross, manifest sins. Those things could be disqualifying, but just that when you observe him, as you should, that you recognize that you have to cover it with love.
Pastors carry a great burden. That's also something that Owen emphasizes here in his directions. And sometimes when people are burdened, we don't always see them at their best. And it's good to remember that when you engage your pastor, you may not always be seeing him at his best. He labors to give his best and to be on his best behavior, but it's not the case that we will always see that. And I think that's where his counsel comes in. The statement he makes and in their infirmities, whilst really such, and appearing through the manifold temptations where they are unto these days exposed, or imposed on them through the zeal of their adversaries that contend against them, are to be covered by love. And this men will do when they conscientiously consider that even the lives of their teachers are an ordinance of God to their relief under temptations and provocation to holiness, zeal, meekness, and self-denial. That what you're looking for is not the one-off event that might have rubbed you the wrong way. You're looking for habitual qualities of godliness being manifested, developed, and strengthened over time, and then emulating those.
All right, so honoring the pastor, watching him, observing him, but observing him with love, and looking for Christ in him. And then what else does Owen cite?
Just coming off of that observation that pastors are not without their failings, he then goes to a third rule that he gives, which is that we should pray for them. That, in fact, they should be, and Paul often himself solicits prayers from the saints, and he solicits prayers actually for the things he's already commissioned to do. So it's you think, well, the pastor's job is to preach, but then Paul will say, pray that the Spirit would give me utterance. And I think we should pray for our pastor's sermons. We should pray for his courage to speak the truth. We should pray for his heart to speak the truth with love. We should pray that the Lord gives him boldness. Paul prays for that as well. And we should also not forget that ministers, especially those who are given the responsibility to teach, are putting themselves out there publicly, and they are more exposed to opposition and to menacing and to threats from those who don't like their message than often the rest of us are. And I think we're mistaken if we think that pastors could not be intimidated by the fear of man, and maybe even be cowed into being silent when they should speak up, or to hedging the truth because the truth might get them in trouble. And so we need to pray actually for the boldness of our pastors, and that utterance would be given to them so that they could really be truly Christ's free man, speaking his word, even in the face of great adversity.
We also know that those who are ministering in that capacity are subject to special temptations. You mentioned the temptation to not speak up and to speak boldly and to speak with clarity, but there are other temptations as well. And we know that there's just a tremendous cost when a pastor is caught up in sin. And we ought to pray for our pastors that they be able to resist temptation, that the Lord leads them away from that, and that they stand firm in their faith. Because if an individual congregant falls, that is a grievous thing. It has a massive ripple effect. But when a minister of the gospel falls, and all of us know something of this, we've at least heard of it or maybe even experienced it. When a pastor falls, what a great harm that does to the church. And the Lord, of course, can work through that, and he does. But the stakes are very high when it comes to pastoral ministry. I'll never forget. It was right before a memorial service for an elderly woman in a church that I was a part of early in life, and the pastor, right before the funeral started, he was speaking to a couple people, and he said, I almost don't know what I'm going to do without this woman praying for me. And she was someone who didn't have a large public influence because she was sick and she was often homebound, but he knew that she was praying for him. And what a ministry that is to our pastors to pray for them.
Owen gives several reasons for this. He says, because of the greatness of the work for which no one is sufficient. There's a sense in which every pastoral act of service is sort of greater than the man who's performing it. He says also because of the strength of opposition which lies against it. In particular, we should think that Satan targets those that are the more public representatives of Christ's church, and for that reason, more earnest prayer should be given for them. Also, he says, because of the concernment of men's souls therein, because these are the ones who are especially appointed to give to give an account for your soul, because they're the ones that are appointed to watch over you. Pray especially for them. And he says, well, he goes on with some others, but those are some of the leading reasons that
Yeah.
he gives for praying for our ministers, but especially that the Lord would put a hedge of protection around them as they're more exposed perhaps than the rest of us.
All right. That brings us to the fourth instruction that Owen gives that we want to deal with today. And so, James, introduce that to us.
It somewhat dovetails nicely with the honoring. I think the honoring has more to do with the office itself, whereas the fourth instruction he gives is to be in submission to them for the work's sake. He cites a few texts, 1 Thessalonians 5. We beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you and are over you in the Lord. And we admonish you to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. I think that the esteeming highly is not just to speak well of them, but when he says to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake, it's the high calling for which we ought to esteem them. In 1 Timothy 5, he says, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in word and doctrine. And so I think this kind of just is a kind of similar to the honoring them. That's honoring the office. This is being subject to them insofar as they have rule over us.
Yeah, and that reminds me of what the Apostle Paul experienced, and as he records it in 2 Timothy 4, where he says, at my first defense, no one stood by me in all of Asia. All forsook me. And what a tragic moment that is, if in a pastor's hour of need, or even in his hour of sort of teaching something hard, that he looks around and no one is there with him. Of course, Paul goes on to say, the Lord stood by me. And so we know that God promises to be faithful. But nonetheless, that's not the picture of the church that any of us should want to be a part of.
There, on the section on prayer, Owen says, when many are not ashamed to revile them in public, some ought to be ashamed not to remember them in private. And the giving them esteem, not flattering them, not putting them up on a throne, so to speak. They are servants after all. But to actually give them the honor that is due given their high calling.
Well, James, I just want to finish our conversation by saying this, and maybe you have something to add that would helpfully summarize it. But of course, it is the case, and this is probably what many people are thinking. Of course, it is the case when sometimes there are sadly instances where pastors do need to be addressed, called out by those who are given that authority, and so that's not necessarily everyone's job, but there are some who are called to give mutual accountability and have mutual accountability with the pastor. I'm thinking of other elders in particular. And in those cases, of course, it has to be said, they need to do their duty before the Lord. If there is theological error, if there is some kind of gross sin or pattern of sin, or if there are other kinds of major problems, those do need to be addressed. And the Bible gives ample instruction for how that is to be done in an orderly way. And so I don't think anything Owen's saying should be interpreted as a kind of blind obedience at all times to everything that the pastor decides to do in a given moment. But at the same time, I think we also should know our own hearts and know that we are going to be far more prone as Christians to do the opposite of that, to really look with disdain on the pastoral office and to not give the honor to whom it's due.
Yeah, and I think that's important. There are some tangible ways in which this honor shows itself. One instruction he gives, for instance, is the maintenance of the minister and his family, to really, because the laborer is worthy of his hire, if he's laboring in word and doctrine, and if he's given his life for the building up of the church and spiritual things, should he not be compensated in the lesser material things of which he has need? These are also ways of honoring, of actually looking looking out for the well-being of the minister, and to a certain extent freeing him from worldly cares so that he can give himself to the ministry of word, of doctrine, and of prayer. Give him the time that it takes to study well. Give him the time that it takes to pray deeply and at great length. Provide what's needed so that he can be free to work in the Lord's vineyard. And so far as so far as you have means to do so, that's also a means of honoring him. The other one you brought up, Jonathan, was the standing beside him. Owen brings this up as a separate sort of instruction. He says, adhere to him and abide by him in all trials and persecutions. This is important for the word. For the word. So if it's trials and persecutions because he's defrauded the government by cheating on his taxes, your obligation is not to stand by him. If it's because he's been harsh and cruel in his treatment of others, there's not an obligation to stand by him. But in so much as he's standing as Christ's man, speaking his word and administering the rule in his church, that there should be a kind of camaraderie. And there's when Paul says no one stood with him in the one case, but Christ stood with him, he then says in Second Timothy, the Lord have mercy on the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me. And Owen cites that text. And I think, he goes on, and was not ashamed of my chain. I think this is the point. When your pastor suffers for the word of God, try to refresh him as often as you can. And don't be ashamed of that. If shame comes on him for the sake of the gospel, then you don't be ashamed of him. We don't want to be fair weather congregants or fair weather Christians. We want to, as we say, stand through thick and thin with the minister insofar as he's seeking to fulfill his calling as a shepherd of Christ's church.
Well, we're grateful for all of you listening in on this conversation, and we welcome your participation. We love hearing from you, so please feel free to give us feedback. If there are people that you know who might benefit from this episode or other episodes, please pass it along. If you can rate and review the podcast, we'd really appreciate that. That helps us greatly in terms of getting the word out about Theology on the Go. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. Also, we've been referring to a book that is part of Owen's larger works, but it's been excerpted and put in a nice paperback format and entitled The Duties of Christian Fellowship, a Manual for Church Members. That's published by our friends at Banner of Truth. And if you'd like to enter to win a copy of this great little work, very, very useful little work, you can do that at placefortruth.org, at the Theology on the Go link, or at theologyonthego.org. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.